Imagine this. Right now, as you watch this video on your charged phone or laptop, nearly 600 million Africans, 43% of the entire continent, have no access to electricity at all. Not unreliable electricity. Not expensive electricity. No electricity. Children cannot study after dark. Clinics cannot refrigerate vaccines. Entrepreneurs cannot run modern businesses. Entire economies cannot industrialize at scale. This is the energy crisis at the heart of Africa's development challenge. And then consider the paradox. Africa receives more solar energy per square meter than almost any place on Earth. It has 60% of the world's best solar resources. It has enormous wind corridors, vast geothermal fields, the world's greatest unexploited hydropower potential. Africa is sitting on the largest clean energy endowment in human history, while 600 million of its people live in darkness. Today on Geothermal Academy, we are going to explore one of the most consequential questions of the 21st century. How important is renewable energy in Africa? The answer touches everything: poverty, sovereignty, climate justice, industrialization, and the future of the planet itself. Let's turn on the lights. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind Geothermal Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. Geothermal is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. Let me put the numbers in front of you clearly, because the scale of the energy crisis determines the scale of the solution required. 600 million Africans, that is more than the entire population of the European Union, live without access to electricity. More than 80% of the global population without electricity lives in Africa. This is not evenly distributed. Nigeria alone has about 86 million people without electricity. The DRC has 79 million. Ethiopia has 56 million. Together, these three countries account for nearly 40% of the continent's entire electricity deficit. And then there's the clean cooking crisis. More than 1 billion Africans, including many who do have grid electricity, cook using charcoal, wood, and animal waste. Indoor air pollution from these cooking fuels kills an estimated 600,000 Africans per year, disproportionately women and children. And here is the injustice at the heart of this story. Africa is responsible for only 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yet it is among the most climate-vulnerable continents, facing increasing droughts, floods, and agricultural disruption from a crisis it barely contributed to creating. The energy picture within Africa is as unequal as the picture between Africa and the rest of the world. South Africa and North Africa together account for less than 20% of the continent's population, but they account for more than 45% of energy investment and more than 65% of installed electrical capacity. This means the bulk of Africa's population in sub-Saharan Africa is being dramatically underserved by both investment and infrastructure. Morocco has achieved near-universal electrification through decades of sustained investment, including the landmark Noor Ouarzazate solar complex. South Africa, despite its significant coal dependency, has 32% renewable energy in its electricity mix in 2025, a substantial share achieved through its Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Procurement Program. Meanwhile, the DRC, which has the largest hydropower potential of any country in the world, with the Grand Inga Dam site alone capable of generating 40,000 megawatts, has electricity access below 30% of its population. The energy geography of Africa is defined by abundance of potential and a massive failure of investment, infrastructure, and governance to convert that potential into power for the people who need it most. Let me be very clear about why energy access matters beyond the obvious. When you have electricity, you can refrigerate vaccines, which means vaccine efficacy in rural clinics goes from near zero to near full. When you have electricity, students can study after dark, which is when most rural students have time to study after agricultural work. When you have electricity, mobile phones can charge. And in Africa, the mobile phone is the bank, the market, the school, and the newspaper. When you have electricity, small businesses can run productive machinery instead of relying on manual labor, which is the entry point for industrialization. The International Energy Agency has calculated that Africa needs $200 billion per year in energy investment by 2030 to achieve universal electricity access and meet its climate commitments. It currently receives about $40 billion. That gap, $160 billion per year, is the distance between Africa's energy potential and its energy reality. And renewable energy matters here, because solar, wind, and mini-grids can often deliver electricity to rural communities faster and cheaper than extending the national grid, the grid that may be years or decades away from reaching them through conventional infrastructure pathways. The solar resource statistic is one of the most important and most scandalous facts in global energy economics. Africa holds 60% of the world's best solar resources. Europe, which leads the world in solar installations and generates enormous amounts of solar electricity, has dramatically inferior solar irradiation compared to most of sub-Saharan Africa. Germany, which is a world leader in solar installation, receives about 1,000 kWh per square meter per year. Lagos receives about 2,000. Nairobi receives about 2,000. Ouagadougou receives over 2,400. Africa is bathed in sunlight and sitting on the world's largest clean energy endowment. Yet Africa accounts for less than 1% of globally installed solar capacity. The gap is not because the sun shines less. The gap is because of financing costs, infrastructure, governance, and the legacy of an energy investment framework that has systematically underinvested in African clean energy. The good news is that this is changing rapidly. Solar PV costs have fallen more than 90% since 2010, making solar now the cheapest source of electricity in history, and cheaper than fossil fuels in most African markets. In June 2025, Africa recorded a 60% year-on-year increase in solar panel imports. The momentum is building. Let me walk you through Africa's 4 major renewable energy pillars, because each one is extraordinary in its own right. Solar, 482,000 gigawatts of theoretical potential. Put that number in perspective. Total global electricity generation capacity is about 10,000 gigawatts. Africa's solar potential is nearly 50 times total global generation capacity. Of course, you can't use all of it. Access to transmission lines, land use, and storage bring the technically exploitable potential down significantly. But even at 10% of theoretical potential, the number is staggering. Wind. Africa has an estimated 1,300 gigawatts of high wind capacity, particularly in the North African corridor stretching from Morocco through Egypt, in East Africa's Rift Valley and Lake Turkana region, and in southern Africa. Geothermal. This is perhaps the least known pillar, but Kenya's success with geothermal is one of Africa's most important energy stories. Kenya gets approximately 47% of its electricity from geothermal. Rystad Energy projects that Africa will overtake Europe in geothermal capacity by 2030. And hydro. The Grand Inga site on the Congo River in the DRC is capable of generating 40,000 megawatts, which would make it, if ever built, the largest power plant in human history, and capable of supplying electricity to about 30% of Africa's entire population. The solar irradiation comparison is the single most powerful argument for why Africa must prioritize solar energy, because the physics are irrefutable and the competitive advantage is permanent. Germany has approximately 90 gigawatts of installed solar capacity and is the model for European solar development. Germany receives about 3 kilowatt-hours per square meter per day of solar irradiation. North Africa receives 6.5. East Africa receives 5.8. West Africa receives 5.2. South Africa receives 5.5. Africa's natural solar advantage over Germany, the continent that has invested most aggressively in solar, is roughly 2 to 2.5 times. That means a solar panel installed in Lagos or Nairobi or Accra or Cairo will produce roughly twice as much electricity per year as an identical panel installed in Berlin. This is a fundamental structural economic advantage. When solar panel prices were high, this advantage was somewhat offset by the higher upfront cost of installation. But with solar panel prices having fallen by over 90% since 2010, and now being the cheapest source of new electricity generation in history, Africa's solar irradiation advantage translates directly into the cheapest electricity in the world if the investment framework exists to support it. The barrier is not the sun. The barrier is capital, governance, and grid infrastructure. Kenya's energy story is one of the most inspiring on the continent, and it deserves to be better known globally. Approximately 90% of Kenya's electricity generation comes from renewable sources: geothermal, hydro, wind, and increasingly solar. This is not an aspirational target. This is the present-day reality of the Kenyan grid. The geothermal story is particularly important. The East African Rift Valley sits on top of one of the world's most extraordinary geothermal resources. The Olkaria field, about 90 kilometers from Nairobi, has been developed over decades into a 985 megawatt complex that provides baseload, meaning always on, 24 hours a day, electricity. Unlike solar and wind, geothermal doesn't depend on weather. It runs continuously. It's the perfect foundation for a clean electricity system. The Lake Turkana wind power project, in northern Kenya, was Africa's largest wind farm when it was commissioned, generating 310 megawatts from 365 Vestas turbines. It cut 574,000 tons of carbon emissions in 2024 alone. Kenya's model demonstrates something crucial. The leapfrog is not just possible in theory. It is already happening. Kenya has essentially jumped from pre-industrial energy poverty in its rural areas, which are far more electrified than comparable rural Africa, directly to a clean, diversified, modern electricity system. The rest of Africa needs to pay attention. The investment data tells a genuinely exciting story about momentum. In 2019, Africa was receiving about $17 billion in clean energy investment annually. By 2021, this had actually fallen to about $2.6 billion, partly due to COVID disruption. But since then, the acceleration has been extraordinary. By 2024, clean energy investment in Africa had reached $40 billion, more than 15 times the 2021 figure in just 3 years. In the first half of 2025, solar panel imports to Africa were up 60% year-on-year, driven particularly by Algeria, Zambia, and Botswana. The Noor Ouarzazate complex in Morocco, the world's largest concentrated solar power complex, provided electricity to more than 2 million Moroccans. Ethiopia's Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, when fully commissioned, will double the country's national power generation and export surplus electricity to 6 neighboring countries. South Africa has procured more than 1,700 megawatts through private renewable energy tenders. Nigeria launched a $750 million solar mini-grid project in 2024 to expand rural access. The numbers are moving. The question is whether they can move fast enough. The African Union has set a target of 300 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030. Achieving that target requires annual deployments of 32.5 gigawatts per year, about 4 times the current rate. That's the challenge. The momentum is real. The scale needs to be significantly higher. The investment chart tells a dramatic story, but it also reveals a critical reality. Africa went through a sharp COVID-era trough in 2021, when clean energy investment collapsed to $2.6 billion, before recovering and accelerating strongly. The 2024 figure of $40 billion represents an extraordinary recovery, but it needs to be contextualized. Africa receives only 2.3% of global clean energy investment, while holding 60% of the world's best solar resources. The world is dramatically underinvesting in African clean energy relative to the continent's resource endowment and its energy needs. The IEA has been clear. Achieving universal electricity access in Africa and meeting climate goals requires investment to more than double from today's $90 billion across all energy sectors to more than $200 billion per year by 2030, with nearly 2/3 of that going to clean energy. We are currently at about $40 billion in clean energy. The gap, $160 billion per year in clean energy investment alone, represents both the scale of the challenge and the scale of the opportunity for investors who understand what's at stake. Let me give you the snapshot of where Africa stands in its renewable deployment. 7.9 gigawatts of new renewable energy was deployed in 2023, a record at the time, and a real acceleration from previous years. But to put it in context, Africa needs to deploy 32.5 gigawatts per year to hit the African Union's 300 gigawatt by 2030 target. So we're at about a quarter of the required pace. The procurement pipeline gives more reason for optimism. Governments across Africa had procured 25 gigawatts of renewable capacity through 2024, with an additional 11 gigawatts through private sector power purchase agreements. These procurements are projects in development. They don't all exist yet, but they represent committed policy and commercial signals that will translate into installed capacity over the next 3 to 5 years. The solar import figure from June 2025 is particularly striking, a 60% year-on-year increase, representing 15 gigawatts of equivalent solar panel capacity. To put that in perspective, Africa's total installed solar capacity from 2000 to 2024 was approximately 15 gigawatts. In 1 month of imports in 2025, Africa imported the equivalent of everything installed in the previous 2.5 decades. That is a step change in the trajectory. Morocco's Noor Ouarzazate solar complex deserves its own slide because it represents a genuine world-class infrastructure achievement that happens to be African. The complex uses concentrated solar power technology, mirrors that focus sunlight to heat fluid, which drives turbines combined with thermal storage, meaning it can continue generating electricity for several hours after the sun sets. When the African Development Bank president visited Noor in 2016, he described it as one of the continent's greatest energy success stories. But the more important context for Morocco's solar achievement is why it happened. Morocco imports more than 90% of its energy. It has no oil, no natural gas, no coal. When global oil prices spike, as they did in the early 2010s, Morocco's import bill became catastrophically expensive. The response was a national determination to build domestic renewable energy capacity as a matter of economic sovereignty. Morocco set ambitious renewable targets, established a credible regulatory framework, attracted international investment, and built the world's most ambitious solar complex in one of the world's sunniest locations. The result: Morocco now exports renewable electricity to Spain and Portugal through the Mediterranean interconnection. A country with no fossil fuels became an energy exporter through solar power. The lesson for the rest of Africa is profound. Energy sovereignty does not require oil. It requires sun and political will. Africa's renewable energy strategy can't be reduced to a single technology. Different resources suit different geographies and use cases. Solar PV has become the cheapest source of new electricity generation in most of Africa, and its modular nature makes it ideal for both utility-scale plants and off-grid mini-grids that can serve rural communities without waiting for grid extension. Wind is particularly powerful in two zones: the North African corridor from Morocco through Egypt, and the East African Rift Valley, where Lake Turkana's constant winds have supported Africa's largest wind project. Geothermal is baseload. It runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of weather, making it the ideal clean complement to solar and wind. Kenya has proven the model works at scale. Hydropower offers the continent's largest individual projects, but comes with environmental concerns around river ecosystems and increasing climate risk as drought patterns change, as Zambia and Zimbabwe discovered painfully when the Kariba Dam dropped to historically low levels in 2024, causing severe load shedding. Mini-grids, small off-grid solar installations with battery storage, are often the fastest and cheapest way to electrify dispersed rural communities that are years away from grid connection. And green hydrogen is the long-term frontier, using Africa's abundant solar and wind to produce hydrogen fuel that can be exported or used domestically for heavy industry. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is one of the most consequential infrastructure projects in Africa this century, and one of the most controversial. Ethiopia began construction in 2011 and has been filling the reservoir since 2020, despite ongoing disputes with Egypt and Sudan. Egypt's position is existential. The Nile provides approximately 95% of Egypt's fresh water, and Egyptian officials have argued that the dam threatens to reduce downstream flows to levels that could devastate Egyptian agriculture. Ethiopia's position is also understandable. The country of approximately 120 million people has enormous energy needs, enormous hydropower resources, and was using virtually none of its Blue Nile potential. At 6,450 megawatts when fully commissioned, GERD is transformative. Ethiopia will go from being an electricity-poor country to a regional electricity exporter, selling power to Sudan, Kenya, Djibouti, and Tanzania. The dam also raises a broader question that Africa will increasingly face as its renewable energy infrastructure scales. Who benefits from large-scale energy infrastructure? When Ethiopia dams the Nile for electricity and export revenue, how are the costs to downstream communities factored in? When Morocco exports solar electricity to Europe, how much of the benefit stays in Morocco? These are the governance questions that will determine whether Africa's renewable energy revolution also becomes an African development revolution. If you are serious about Africa's future, you must also become serious about personal growth, execution, discipline, entrepreneurship, and building. Knowledge without implementation changes nothing. That is exactly why I'm building the GreenWave Inner Circle, an execution-focused community for builders, creators, entrepreneurs, and purpose-driven individuals. A space focused on accountability, implementation, entrepreneurship, transformation, AI and digital leverage, community, and real progress. Weekly live sessions, execution systems, focused builders, real conversations, real growth. If you are tired of consuming endlessly and ready to start building intentionally, scan the QR code or use the link below to join the early interest list. Stop consuming, start building. Don't build alone. Join the GreenWave Inner Circle and connect with a community focused on real execution and transformation. Scan the QR code to begin. The off-grid solar revolution is arguably the most important and underreported renewable energy story in Africa. When we talk about renewable energy, we often think of large-scale solar farms, wind parks, and hydroelectric dams. But for the 600 million Africans without electricity access, none of those large-scale solutions are likely to reach them in the near term. What is reaching them is off-grid solar, pay-as-you-go solar systems. Small rooftop solar panels paired with LED lights, phone charging ports, and sometimes small appliances can be purchased by households using mobile money in small, daily, or weekly payments. Companies like M-Kopa, D-Light, BBOXX, and SunCulture have collectively reached tens of millions of households across Africa with these systems. A family in rural Uganda that couldn't afford kerosene for their lamps and was spending several dollars a week on it can now switch to a solar system with better light quality, phone charging, and eventually a radio or small TV at a similar weekly cost that decreases over time as the system is paid off. Mini-grids take this further. Community-scale solar installations with battery storage that can power an entire village of several hundred households, a school, a clinic, and small businesses. In 2024, Nigeria launched a $750 million solar mini-grid program, specifically to address the communities that are furthest from the national grid. These off-grid and mini-grid solutions are often faster to deploy, cheaper to build, and more resilient than grid extension, and they create the local energy infrastructure that communities can maintain and expand. South Africa's renewable energy story is dramatic and paradoxical. The country is Africa's most coal-dependent major economy. Coal has historically provided 80 to 90% of its electricity. But South Africa also runs Africa's largest renewable energy independent power producer procurement program, known as REIPPPP, a program that has successfully contracted over 6,000 megawatts of renewable capacity from independent power producers. And then there is the rooftop solar story, which was triggered not by climate policy but by crisis. Eskom, South Africa's state power utility, experienced catastrophic load shedding from 2022 to 2024, cutting electricity to households and businesses for up to 12 hours per day in the worst periods. The economic damage was enormous, billions of rands in lost productivity per day. The response of South African households and businesses was to install rooftop solar, millions of systems that collectively amount to several gigawatts of distributed generation. By 2025, South Africa had approximately 20 gigawatts of rooftop solar installed on homes and businesses, more than some European countries in total installed solar capacity. The paradox is that South Africa's worst energy failure, Eskom's load shedding, may have done more to accelerate renewable deployment than any government policy. The load shedding crisis is largely resolved now, partly because of the rooftop solar boom it triggered. Crisis became catalyst. The paradox of African renewable energy is stark. The sun shines more in Africa than almost anywhere else. Solar is now the cheapest electricity source in history. Africa has the most people without electricity in the world, the largest potential market for new energy services. And yet 64% of energy investment in Africa in 2024 went to fossil fuels, compared to global clean energy receiving a 2-to-1 advantage over fossil fuels. Why? The barriers are multiple and interconnected. First, cost of capital. A solar project in Germany might secure financing at 5 or 6% interest. The same project with the same technology in Nigeria might face financing costs of 20 to 25%, because international lenders price African political and currency risk at a premium that makes projects financially unviable. Second, currency risk. African projects earn revenue in local currencies, nairas, shillings, cedis, but loans are often denominated in dollars or euros. When local currencies depreciate against the dollar, project revenues become insufficient to service dollar-denominated debt. Third, infrastructure. Transmission lines are needed to move electricity from a wind farm in the desert to a city where it's needed. Many African countries lack the grid infrastructure to connect new renewable projects to demand centers. Fourth, policy inconsistency. Investors need regulatory certainty over the 15 to 20-year life of a solar project. In countries where energy policies change frequently, or where power purchase agreements are not honored, investment dries up. The cost of capital problem is the most important barrier to African renewable energy deployment, and the one that gets least attention in global conversations. Let me make it concrete. A solar farm in Morocco or in Kenya or in South Africa needs to raise capital to build the plant. The plant then earns revenue by selling electricity over a 15 to 25-year period. Whether the project is financially viable depends on how expensive the upfront capital is, the interest rate. In Germany, a renewable energy project might secure financing at 4 to 6%. Historically low rates that reflect Germany's political stability, strong regulatory framework, and stable currency. In Nigeria, the same technology project, the same engineering specs, the same electricity output, might face financing costs of 20 to 25%. Why? Because international lenders are pricing in political risk, currency risk, and regulatory risk. The higher cost of capital doesn't mean Nigeria's sun is less bright. It means the financing system is systematically punishing Africa for risks, some real, some perceived, that make African renewable projects less financially viable than European ones, even when the underlying physics are better. The solution requires interventions at the capital market level, concessional loans from development finance institutions, guarantees that reduce perceived risk, currency swap facilities that protect against depreciation, and standardized bankable frameworks for power purchase agreements. These tools exist. They are not being deployed at anywhere near the scale required. Infrastructure is the second major barrier, and it's actually several distinct problems. The transmission problem. Many of Africa's best renewable resources are in remote locations. The Sahara Desert has extraordinary solar irradiation, but almost no population. Morocco's wind is strongest in the far south. Lake Turkana in Kenya is in a remote arid zone. To use these resources, you need transmission infrastructure to move the electricity to where people live. Building transmission lines across hundreds of kilometers of undeveloped terrain is expensive, complex, and requires government coordination on land rights and regulatory frameworks. The grid stability problem. Even where renewable capacity is being added, the existing electricity grids in many African countries are fragile, undersized, poorly maintained, and unable to handle variable renewable energy without storage or grid modernization. South Africa's Eskom crisis was partly about aging coal plants failing, but the grid infrastructure limitations also constrained how quickly renewable capacity could compensate. And then the climate risk paradox. Hydropower, which currently accounts for about 17% of Africa's electricity, is increasingly vulnerable to climate change itself. The 2024 drought that depleted the Kariba Dam to record low levels caused severe load shedding in Zambia and Zimbabwe, a dramatic illustration of the danger of depending on a single climate-vulnerable energy source. The Mission 300 commitment in 2025, $40 billion from the World Bank, $18 billion from the AFDB, specifically addresses these infrastructure gaps. It's the most significant energy infrastructure commitment in African history. Whether it translates into actual connections will be the test of the next 5 years. South Africa's Just Transition Challenge is the most politically complex renewable energy story on the continent, because it sits at the intersection of climate, jobs, development, and international finance in a uniquely intense way. South Africa generates 58% of its electricity from coal in 2025, down from around 90% in 2010, so significant progress has been made. But 58% from coal is still a very high figure for a country that has committed to Paris Agreement targets and that has the economic capacity to deploy alternatives. The problem is coal employment. The Mpumalanga region, where most of South Africa's coal power stations are located, is home to hundreds of thousands of coal miners and power station workers and their families. A rapid coal phase-out without a credible plan for alternative livelihoods would devastate these communities. This is the just transition. The transition to clean energy must be managed in a way that doesn't impose all the costs on the workers and communities that built the country's energy system. In 2022, a consortium of Western countries, the United States, United Kingdom, European Union, France, and Germany, committed $11.6 billion to South Africa's Just Energy Transition Partnership. This is meaningful money, but it comes with conditions, commitments on timelines, governance, and debt terms that have been contested. The broader question is whether wealthy countries, which became wealthy in part by burning the fossil fuels that caused climate change, will actually deliver the finance they've promised to help Africa transition cleanly. Let me name the debate honestly, because it's a real one, with legitimate arguments on multiple sides. On one side, the leapfrog case. Africa's lack of fossil fuel infrastructure is actually an opportunity. The continent can build clean energy infrastructure from scratch, without the stranded asset problem that wealthy countries face. Solar and wind are now cheaper than fossil fuels on a levelized cost basis in most African markets. The fuel savings from renewable energy over 30 years would exceed the investment cost. Climate change, if unchecked, will devastate African agriculture, water security, and coastal cities, making the case for staying on fossil fuels a case for economic suicide in the long run. On the other side, the development realism argument. Renewables, especially solar and wind, are variable. They don't generate electricity at night or when the wind doesn't blow. Building a reliable industrial economy on variable renewable energy requires expensive battery storage or long-distance transmission. Natural gas, which Africa has in abundance, with over 620 trillion cubic feet of reserves, provides the always-on baseload power that factories, smelters, and data centers need. And here's the moral case. Wealthy countries industrialized on coal and oil for 150 years. They became wealthy doing it. Now they're asking Africa to forego that pathway, for a climate crisis Africa barely contributed to, without providing the finance that would make a clean pathway economically viable. That is a legitimate grievance. The honest answer to the leapfrog versus gas debate is that it's not binary, and pretending it is serves neither development nor climate objectives. Let me try to be clear about where the strongest arguments lie on each side. The strongest part of the leapfrog case is economic. The numbers from PowerShift Africa and the Institute for Sustainable Futures are clear. A fully renewable African energy system would cost $7.3 trillion over 30 years, but save $8.3 trillion in fuel costs. That's a positive return on investment before accounting for climate benefits. Solar costs have fallen so dramatically that in most African markets, solar is already the cheapest source of new electricity. The strongest part of the development realism case is industrial. Factories that make steel, aluminum, cement, and fertilizers need electricity that is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, regardless of weather. Currently, battery storage at the scale needed to back up a solar-powered industrial economy is expensive. Natural gas, which Africa has in abundance, can provide that reliability while renewable costs continue to fall and storage technology improves. The policy conclusion that most serious analysts are reaching is this: maximize renewable deployment as fast as possible, use concessional finance to make storage and grid upgrades viable, and if gas must be used as a bridge, use African gas for African electrification rather than exporting it to Europe, keeping both the economic benefit and the energy security on the continent. The economics of the fully renewable pathway are, frankly, more compelling than most people realize. The $7.3 trillion investment figure sounds enormous, but over 30 years, it averages to about $240 billion per year. That's a large number, but it's comparable to what wealthy countries are spending on their own energy transitions. And the $8.3 trillion in fuel savings over the same period means the investment pays for itself, plus generates additional surplus. The net result by 2050 would be a continent with cheap, clean, domestically produced electricity, without the fuel import bills that currently drain African economies of foreign exchange every year. The 2.2 million new energy jobs include manufacturing, installation, maintenance, and operation of renewable energy infrastructure. The comparison to fossil fuel job losses is favorable. Renewable energy is more labor-intensive per unit of energy produced than oil and gas extraction. The physical constraints are also non-binding. A fully renewable Africa would need to install 3,500 gigawatts of capacity on less than 1% of Africa's land area, tapping just 1% of the continent's total renewable potential. The sun, the wind, the geothermal resources are not the constraints. The constraints are the $200 billion per year financing gap and the governance frameworks needed to make investments bankable. These are solvable problems, if the political will exists. Green hydrogen is the most speculative but potentially most transformative element of Africa's renewable energy future. The concept is straightforward. Use renewable electricity, ideally very cheap solar or wind electricity, to power an electrolyzer that splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen can then be used as a clean fuel for industry, transportation, or heating, or exported as ammonia or liquid hydrogen to energy-importing countries. Why does Africa matter for green hydrogen? Because green hydrogen production costs depend almost entirely on the cost of the renewable electricity used to produce it. Countries with the cheapest renewable electricity will have the cheapest green hydrogen. Africa, with its extraordinary solar and wind resources, is positioned to have the world's cheapest renewable electricity, and therefore the world's cheapest green hydrogen. Morocco is already positioning itself as a major green hydrogen exporter to Europe through its existing Mediterranean electricity connections. Namibia's Hyphen project in the Tsau Kaib region, one of Africa's sunniest desert areas, is designed to produce 300,000 tons of green hydrogen annually for European export. South Africa is exploring green hydrogen for domestic steel and mining applications, which would reduce the country's dependence on imported fossil fuels for heavy industry. The timeline for commercial-scale green hydrogen is still a decade or more away, but the countries that make the right infrastructure and regulatory investments now will capture the early mover advantage in a market that could be worth hundreds of billions of dollars by 2040. Let me give you the critical path. The 5 things that, if done well in the next decade, will determine whether Africa's renewable energy potential becomes real deployed capacity or remains stranded in the ground. First, fix the cost of capital. This is the single most important lever. International development finance institutions, the World Bank, AFDB, OPIC, British International Investment, DFI Europe, need to dramatically scale their guarantees, first loss facilities, and concessional finance programs specifically designed to reduce perceived risk in African renewable energy projects. The 20-point interest rate gap between European and African project finance is not primarily a reflection of real risk. It is a reflection of institutional bias, unfamiliarity, and historical underinvestment. Second, build the transmission grid. Africa's regional power pools, SAP in Southern Africa, WAPP in West Africa, EAPP in East Africa, are the continental infrastructure that can connect renewable resources to demand centers across national borders. Cross-border transmission upgrades are some of the highest return infrastructure investments available. Third, regulatory consistency. No investor will commit capital for 20 years in a market where the government might change the rules in 3. Consistent, transparent, independent regulatory frameworks are as important as physical infrastructure for attracting the renewable investment Africa needs. Fourth, scale off-grid solutions. For the communities furthest from the national grid, the fastest path to electricity is not grid extension. It's mini-grids and PAYG solar. Mission 300 must translate its funding commitments into actual connections, not just pledges. Fifth, green hydrogen positioning. The window to become the world's green hydrogen supplier is open now. Countries that build the regulatory frameworks, secure the water rights, and establish the port infrastructure for green hydrogen export now will capture a first-mover advantage in a multi-trillion-dollar market. Mission 300 is the most significant international commitment to African energy access ever made, and it deserves to be understood both for what it represents and for the legitimate questions it raises. $40 billion from the World Bank and $18.2 billion from the African Development Bank, over $58 billion in total, specifically targeting the connection of 300 million Africans to electricity by 2030. If these commitments are delivered at the speed and scale required, they would be genuinely transformative. Half of the funds are specifically designated for renewable energy projects, mini-grids, standalone solar systems, and decentralized clean energy infrastructure. This is the right emphasis. For the hardest-to-reach populations, renewable off-grid solutions are almost always faster and cheaper than grid extension. But the legitimate critique that advocates have raised is about the financing structure. Africa's external debt burden is already substantial. Many countries are spending more on debt service than on health or education. If Mission 300 funds come primarily as loans rather than grants, the beneficiaries will be connecting communities to electricity while deepening their government's debt obligations. The climate justice argument here is powerful. Wealthy countries that became wealthy burning fossil fuels that caused climate change owe African countries the investment in clean energy as a matter of reparative justice, not as a loan to be repaid with interest. Whether Mission 300 represents a genuine new chapter in climate finance, or another iteration of development lending with conditions attached, is the question the next 5 years will answer. Let me put the two scenarios in front of you clearly, because the divergence in outcomes is vast. The stalled scenario is not far-fetched. It's essentially what the current trajectory looks like if the investment gap persists. Clean energy investment stays at 40 to 50 billion per year, well below the 200 billion needed. The cost of capital problem remains unsolved. Africa's best renewable projects don't get financed because private investors go to easier markets. 500 million Africans are still without electricity in 2035. The continent develops its gas reserves, using African resources for African industrialization, which has its own logic, but doesn't build the renewable foundation for the clean energy future. The accelerated scenario requires things to go right on multiple dimensions simultaneously. Mission 300 delivers real connections at scale. Climate finance scales dramatically and increasingly comes as grants rather than loans. The cost of capital gap closes through innovative financial instruments, and African governments maintain the policy consistency that makes long-term renewable investment bankable. If those things happen, Africa in 2035 is a very different place. The world's fastest-growing clean energy market, the world's cheapest renewable electricity producer, a growing green hydrogen exporter, and a continent where the energy foundation for industrial development exists. The choice between these scenarios is being made right now, in the offices of development banks, in the budget decisions of African finance ministries, in the investment decisions of pension funds and clean energy companies, and in the negotiating rooms where climate finance commitments are being made and either honored or broken. The climate justice argument for African renewable energy is the most important framing that doesn't get enough attention in global energy discussions. Let me state it plainly. The United States, Europe, and the industrialized world spent approximately 150 years burning coal, oil, and gas to power the economic growth that made them wealthy. This process released the greenhouse gases that have caused global warming. Africa, which industrialized late and minimally, is responsible for less than 4% of cumulative global greenhouse gas emissions. Yet Africa is among the most severely affected by climate change. Increasing droughts in the Sahel, intensifying tropical cyclones on the Indian Ocean coast, rising sea levels threatening coastal cities, changing rainfall patterns disrupting agriculture. This is a profound injustice. The people least responsible for causing the problem are bearing the greatest costs. The climate finance commitment from wealthy nations. Most recently, the $100 billion per year pledge made at Paris in 2015, which was not delivered on schedule, is the international community's acknowledgement that this injustice exists and that compensatory investment is owed. The transition to renewable energy in Africa is therefore not just an economic opportunity and not just an environmental necessity. It is a matter of justice. The right of African people to develop their economies, to access the electricity that enables modern life, and to do so in a way that doesn't deepen a climate crisis they didn't create, and without being saddled with debt for doing the world a favor. I want to close this section by stepping back from the economics and the technology and saying something about what Africa's renewable energy transition means at a deeper level. Energy is not just a development input. It is a dimension of sovereignty. Countries that depend on imported fossil fuels, whose electricity generation depends on oil prices set in Houston, gas prices set in Moscow, or coal prices set in Jakarta, are economically vulnerable in ways that undermine their political independence. Every time an oil price spike hits a fuel-importing African country, government revenues fall, import bills rise, and the fiscal space for development shrinks. This is not coincidence. It is the structural condition of an economy built on colonial foundations, where energy systems were designed to move African resources out, not to provide African people with power. Renewable energy, particularly solar, offers something radical. Energy generated entirely from local resources, using local labor, serving local needs, and building local assets. A solar panel on a Kenyan school roof is an asset owned by the Kenyan people. A geothermal power station in the Rift Valley is owned by Kenya Power. A wind farm in Morocco generates electricity that Morocco controls and can sell to Europe on its own terms. Thomas Sankara said it 4 decades ago, "The sun belongs to us." The technology to capture that ownership is now available, affordable, and proven. The gap between the solar resources Africa has and the solar capacity Africa has deployed is not a physics problem or a technology problem. It is a political and financial problem, and political and financial problems can be solved by political will and financial commitment. So how important is renewable energy in Africa? After 30 minutes of data, history, case studies, debates, and honest assessment, here is the answer. Renewable energy in Africa is not important. It is existential. It is existential for the 600 million Africans currently living without electricity, for whom renewable off-grid and mini-grid solutions are the fastest and most affordable path to the lights, the phone charging, the medical refrigeration, and the economic activity that electricity makes possible. It is existential for the continent's industrialization ambitions, because cheap, reliable electricity is the foundation on which manufacturing, processing, and value addition are built, and renewable energy is now the cheapest source of new electricity on the continent. It is existential for Africa's climate resilience, because a continent that continues to depend on fossil fuels while facing the worst consequences of the climate crisis is making a choice that compounds its own vulnerability. And it is existential for global climate goals, because you cannot achieve the Paris Agreement without Africa participating in the clean energy transition. The good news is that the momentum is real. Solar is cheaper than it has ever been. Investment is accelerating. Morocco has proven the continental-scale renewable model. Kenya has proven the diverse renewable model. South Africa has proven that crisis can become catalyst. Ghana has 38% renewables. Kenya has 90%. The path is visible. What it needs is the capital, the political will, and the international climate finance to deploy it 4 times faster than the current pace. The sun belongs to Africa. The decision of whether to use it belongs to all of us. What do you think? Drop it in the comments. This has been Geothermal Academy. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.